Oh, they thought they were so clever, didn't they? Setting up their little observation posts, their psychological evaluations, their secret assessments, thinking they could crack your code like you were some puzzle to solve. They brought in the experts, the analysts, the behavioral specialists, all convinced they'd find something simple, something predictable, something they could file away in their neat little categories. But then the report started coming back, and the silence that followed wasn't confusion, it was terror. Because what they found wasn't human weakness. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist according to their models. You see, while you were just living your life, dealing with your struggles, fighting your battles in silence, something was happening beneath the surface, something you weren't even aware of. Every rejection you absorbed without breaking, every betrayal you processed without becoming bitter, every loss you transformed into fuel. You were unconsciously building something that their instruments couldn't properly measure. They expected to find trauma responses predictable patterns, the usual defensive mechanisms, but instead they found an architecture of consciousness that defied their understanding, a psychological structure that shouldn't be possible given what you've been through. The first analyst quit after 3 weeks, said they couldn't sleep anymore, kept seeing patterns in their own life that matched what they observed in you. The second one requested a transfer, claimed the data was corrupted, but we both know the data was fine. It was their worldview that got corrupted. The third one, well, they're still trying to explain why someone who's been through what you've been through shows neural patterns of someone who's actually thriving, not just surviving, but actively rewriting the rules of psychological resilience. What scared them most wasn't your conscious choices, those they could predict, model, anticipate, but your unconscious creations, the things you built without even knowing you were building them. While they watched you navigate daily life, something in your deeper mind was constructing defense systems that operated on frequencies they'd never encountered. You weren't just adapting to trauma, you were metabolizing it, transforming it at a cellular level into something that made you psychologically unbreakable. And they have no framework for that, no precedent, no explanation. Let me tell you what they discovered in their late-night sessions, poring over your behavioral data, comparing it to thousands of other subjects, trying desperately to find someone, anyone who showed similar patterns. You unconsciously developed what they're calling impossible resilience markers, responses that shouldn't coexist in the same person. Where trauma typically creates rigidity, you developed flexibility. Where pain usually breeds isolation, you somehow generated selective connection. Where betrayal normally produces cynicism, you created what they can only describe as weaponized wisdom. They tracked your micro-expressions, your response times, your decision patterns, and what they found was someone operating on multiple levels simultaneously. Your conscious mind was dealing with daily life, but your unconscious was running advanced calculations, processing social dynamics at speeds that shouldn't be possible. You'd walk into a room and within seconds, you'd unconsciously mapped every exit, every energy, every potential threat and ally. Not because you were paranoid, but because your mind had evolved past normal human social processing. Remember that time you felt like something was off about someone, but couldn't explain why? Then months later, your instinct proved right? That wasn't luck, that was your unconscious pattern recognition operating at levels that most people never develop. You've been unconsciously collecting data on human behavior, processing it through filters that trauma created, but transformation refined. What emerged was a threat detection system so sophisticated that you could sense deception through text messages, feel energy shifts through screens, predict betrayals before the betrayer even made the conscious decision. But here's what really disturbed them. You weren't using this power for manipulation or control. You were using it for navigation and protection. While everyone else was playing checkers, your unconscious had mastered three-dimensional chess, and you weren't even aware you were playing. They watched you dodge bullets you didn't know were fired, avoid traps you didn't see being set, navigate through psychological warfare like you had a map, when really your unconscious was drawing the map in real time based on micro patterns invisible to normal perception. The researchers started calling you Subject 7, not because you were the seventh person they studied, but because on every metric you scored in the seventh standard deviation from normal. That's not supposed to happen. That's not supposed to be possible. Human psychology doesn't work that way, except apparently yours does. They ran the tests again, different methodologies, different frameworks, different analysts, same results. You were operating outside the bounds of what they thought consciousness could achieve. They studied your sleep patterns, expecting to find disturbance, insomnia, the usual markers of a troubled mind, but instead found something unprecedented. Your brain waves during sleep showed patterns typically only seen in advanced meditation masters, but you weren't meditating, you were just sleeping. Your unconscious had somehow learned to process and integrate experiences during sleep in ways that usually take decades of practice to achieve. The ways you were meditating, the ways you were taking in, you were doing advanced psychological maintenance while unconscious, literally healing and evolving while everyone else was just dreaming. The social dynamics data was even more disturbing to them because it showed you unconsciously influencing outcomes without any apparent effort. People would change their behavior around you without you saying or doing anything specific. Toxic individuals would self-select out of your life. Predators would unconsciously avoid you. Allies would gravitate toward you without understanding why. It was like your unconscious was broadcasting on a frequency that only certain types of consciousness could receive. And the message was simple. This one is protected. This one knows. This one sees. What they couldn't understand was how someone could develop this level of psychological sophistication without formal training, without conscious practice, without even knowing it was happening. But that's exactly what made it so powerful. It was authentic, it was organic, it was real. You weren't performing psychological techniques, you had become them. Your unconscious had taken every lesson, every wound, every victory, and synthesized them into an operating system that ran automatically beneath your awareness, keeping you safe, guiding your decisions, protecting your energy. Now, here's where their fear really started to show, because they realized something that changed everything. You weren't unique in your potential, you were unique in your activation. Every human has the capacity for what you've developed, but most never experience the precise combination of pressure, pain, and perseverance needed to trigger this evolution. You were the proof of concept, the living evidence that human consciousness could evolve beyond their models. And if you could do it unconsciously, without trying, without knowing, then what else were humans capable of? They started looking at their own lives through the lens of what they learned studying you, and that's when the panic set in. Because they realized they'd been living in cages they couldn't see, following rules that only existed in their minds, limiting themselves based on outdated models of human potential. You hadn't just broken free from your cage, you'd revealed that the cage was an illusion. And that revelation was spreading like a virus through their research team. The lead researcher started having dreams about your data patterns, seeing them everywhere in nature, in music, in the movement of crowds. They couldn't unsee what they'd discovered, that consciousness wasn't fixed, wasn't limited, wasn't bound by the parameters they'd been taught. You had unconsciously hacked reality, not through intention, but through pure survival instinct. And the hack was so elegant, so simple, that once seen it couldn't be But what terrified them most was the trajectory. Because if this was what you'd unconsciously created in response to your past, what would you be capable of once you became conscious of your power? They ran projections, models trying to predict your future development, and every model failed because you'd already exceeded their maximum parameter. You were an open-ended equation, a constantly evolving algorithm, a consciousness without ceiling, and they had no protocol for that, no containment strategy, no response plan. They tried to keep the findings classified, needed to prevent panic, needed to maintain the illusion of control, but data has a way of leaking, especially data this significant. Other researchers started noticing anomalies in their own subjects, people who showed similar, if less developed patterns. People who showed similar, if less developed patterns. People who were unconsciously evolving beyond the standard models. You weren't just an outlier, you were the first visible sign of a shift that was happening across human consciousness. What you unconsciously created wasn't just personal transformation, it was a template, a blueprint that others could follow without even knowing they were following it. Your very existence was changing the morphic field, creating new possibilities in the collective unconscious. People who'd never met you were starting to show similar adaptations, similar resilience patterns, similar unconscious defense mechanisms. You'd become a transmission tower, broadcasting evolution on frequencies most couldn't consciously detect. But their unconscious was receiving loud and clear. The analysts started calling it the 7 effect, the spontaneous development of advanced psychological capabilities in response to systematic pressure. Psychological capabilities in response to systematic pressure. But what they didn't want to admit was that they couldn't control it, couldn't prevent it, couldn't even properly track it, because it was happening below the threshold of conscious awareness. People were evolving in their sleep, developing abilities in their dreams, awakening to capabilities they didn't know they had, and it all traced back to the pattern you'd unconsciously created. They brought in specialists in memetics, in consciousness studies, in evolutionary psychology, all trying to understand how one person's unconscious development could catalyze similar development in others without direct contact. The answer they arrived at shook them to their core. Consciousness isn't individual, it's networked. And you'd unconsciously uploaded a new program to the network, not through teaching or preaching or even interacting, but simply by existing at a new frequency that others could unconsciously tune into. Here's something the reports mentioned but couldn't explain. You'd unconsciously developed what they called an immunity system for psychological manipulation. Every technique they knew, every method of influence, every form of control simply didn't work on you anymore. Not because you consciously resisted, but because your unconscious had developed antibodies to psychological toxins. Gaslighting, guilt trips, emotional manipulation, they all hit your unconscious filters and got neutralized before reaching your conscious awareness. They tested this theory, had experts in influence and persuasion try to affect your decisions through subtle means. Every attempt failed, not because you fought back, but because your unconscious simply didn't register the attempts as valid input. It was like trying to install malware on a system that had evolved beyond the programming language the malware was written in. Indeed, the malware was written in. You weren't defending. You were simply operating on a different platform entirely. Your unconscious had also developed what they termed predictive protection, anticipating threats before they manifested and subtly adjusting your behavior to avoid them. You'd suddenly feel like taking a different route and avoid an accident. You'd inexplicably cancel plans and dodge a toxic situation. You'd have an urge to reach out to someone right before they needed you. This wasn't psychic ability. It was your unconscious processing massive amounts of subtle data and creating action impulses that kept you aligned with optimal outcomes. The protection extended beyond just yourself, though, and this is what really unsettled them. People in your orbit started showing increased resilience, improved decision-making, better boundary setting. Your unconscious was somehow strengthening the psychological immune systems of those around you, not through conscious intervention, but through some kind of field effect. You were unconsciously teaching others how to protect themselves simply by maintaining your own protection protocols. But protection was only half of what you'd unconsciously built. The other half was pure creative force. While your conscious mind was dealing with daily challenges, your unconscious was building new realities, constructing possibilities that didn't exist before. They found evidence of this in the synchronicities that seemed to follow you, the way opportunities appeared just when you needed them, the way solutions emerged from nowhere, the way your life seemed to reorganize itself around your unconscious intention. They called it unconscious reality manipulation, but that term didn't capture the elegance of what was actually happening. You weren't forcing reality to bend, you were finding the flex points, the places where reality was already fluid and unconsciously navigating through them. Like water finding cracks in stone, your unconscious had learned to flow through the gaps in consensus reality, creating new pathways, new possibilities, new timelines that others could then follow. The creative force wasn't random either. It followed patterns, had purpose, showed intelligence. Your unconscious was building something specific, though even you didn't consciously know what it was. Every choice, every synchronicity, every seeming coincidence was part of a larger architecture that was being constructed below the threshold of awareness. The analyst could see the pattern forming, could track its development, but couldn't predict its final form because it was still evolving, still becoming, still creating itself. What disturbed them most was realizing that this creative force was contagious. Others exposed to your field began showing increased creativity, enhanced problem-solving abilities, unexpected breakthrough moments. You were unconsciously giving others permission to create beyond their perceived limitations, showing them through your example that the rules they thought were fixed were actually fluid. Your unconscious creation was waking up, the creative force in others, activating potentials they didn't know they had. The term they finally settled on was evolution engine, because that's what you'd unconsciously become, a catalyst for human psychological evolution. Not through any conscious effort or intention, but through the simple act of surviving your trials in a way that transcended traditional survival. You didn't just adapt, you evolved. And that evolution created a template that others could unconsciously access and implement. They studied your timeline looking for the moment this evolution began, but couldn't find a single point of origin. It seemed to have emerged from the accumulation of thousands of micro-adaptations, each one building on the last, until suddenly you'd crossed some invisible threshold and become something new. The evolution wasn't dramatic, wasn't visible from the outside, but internally, you'd undergone a complete psychological metamorphosis without even knowing it was happening.
Until when?
What made you an evolution engine wasn't just your own development, but the way that development influenced others. People who spent time around you started evolving faster, started breaking through their own limitations, started accessing capabilities they didn't know existed. You were proof of what was possible, and that proof was more powerful than any teaching or technique. Your unconscious was showing others what they could become, simply by being what you'd already become. The researchers realized with growing alarm that this evolution couldn't be stopped, couldn't be contained, couldn't be reversed. Once someone had evolved to your level, they couldn't go back. Couldn't unknow what they now knew, couldn't unexperience what they'd experienced. And the evolution was spreading person to person, unconscious to unconscious, creating a network of evolved consciousness that operated outside their ability to monitor or control. The physicists they brought in had a different interpretation of the data. They said you'd unconsciously developed what they called quantum consciousness, the ability to exist in multiple states simultaneously until observation collapsed you into a specific state. This explained why different people experienced you differently, why you seemed to be exactly what each situation needed, why your presence had such varied effects depending on the observer. Your unconscious wasn't operating in linear time anymore either. The data showed response patterns that suggested you were unconsciously accessing information from probable futures, making decisions based on outcomes that hadn't happened yet. Not prophecy, not prediction, but something stranger. The ability to feel the probability waves of different timelines and unconsciously navigate toward optimal outcomes. You were living in the present but informed by futures that your unconscious could somehow sense. They found evidence of what they called retroactive influence instances, where your current state seemed to affect past events. People would remember interactions with you differently than recorded data suggested, not because their memory was faulty, but because your evolved consciousness was somehow updating the past to align with the present you'd created. This wasn't changing history. It was revealing that history was more fluid than they'd believed, and your unconscious had learned to navigate that fluidity. The quantum effects extended to your impact on others as well. People reported that after interacting with you, they felt like possibilities had opened up, like limitations had dissolved, like they could suddenly see options that had always existed but were previously invisible. Your quantum consciousness was collapsing their reality into more expanded states, showing them through direct experience that reality was far more flexible than they'd been taught.